Brothers and sisters, welcome to the Son of the North podcast. I am your host Rex, serving as your guiding light through the darkness of this age. This is the 5th episode of the Son of the North podcast. If you enjoyed today's show, make sure to follow the Son of the North podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, YouTube, BitChute, or any other platform where podcasts can be found. Also, if you're craving more than your weekly dose of ancestral tradition, you can follow me, Rex, on Instagram at the handle Son of Diaus. On my Instagram page, you will find more great Son of the North content, including hunting stories, tips and tricks for self-improvement, theological discussion, and more. I will also be hinting at the topic of each week's new episode of Son of the North on my Instagram page, so make sure to keep your eyes open for that. Once again, my friends, my name is Rex. Like the wheels of a chariot, let's get rolling. You gotta love that intro. There's nothing like the sound of the steps to get your heart racing and your blood pumping. Welcome, my friends, to episode 5 of the Son of the North podcast. Today is Sunday, May 23rd, 2021. Summer has finally arrived in Hyperborea, and up here in my neck of the woods, I've been pretty busy, between work and all of the hunting and fishing I've been trying to fit into my schedule. I find myself very fortunate that I work in an industry where I'm not trapped in an office all day. I need to be out in the field, out in the woods, doing my job. I mean, what's not to like about getting paid to stumble around in the bush all day? Luckily, while I'm working, I'm able to engage my other hobbies. I often use my work as an opportunity to scout ahead for the next weekend's hunt. Just yesterday, I was driving home after doing a long day of survey work. I looked to my left and saw foraging in the long grass at the side of the road, a good-sized brown bear. Now, we have grizzlies in my area, but this actually wasn't a grizzly bear. I think the odds are about 1 in 10 of all black bears are actually born with a genetic mutation which turns them a brown color. These black bears are referred to as cinnamon bears simply so we don't confuse them with the grizzly bear, which is also known as the brown bear. From a quick glance, I could tell that this bear was pretty mature. He was a pretty good size, probably about 400 pounds. After a bit more scouting, I think I've decided that this guy's going to be the perfect target for this week's hunt, which I'll actually be on probably as you're listening to this podcast. If I'm successful in tracking down and bagging this bear, I'll make sure to update you guys on Instagram. A hunter can't expect to be successful every time he goes out, but I think we've got some pretty good odds this weekend. If not, my favorite fishing hole is nearby, so I'm not too bothered. But enough of me telling you about my week. Let's get on with the show. This week, we're going to discuss a major heroic archetype that pops up quite often in our ancestral myths. Now, this heroic archetype is one of many heroic archetypes, which are all part of a system that I wish to explore in a future video. It is difficult to reveal a plethora of hidden knowledge all at once. Today, we will start with one story. Gather around the campfire, my friends. Today I will tell you the story of the Prince of the Woods. The story I tell to you today dates to a long, long time ago. The ancestors in this story, our ancestors, lived during an age of gold, an age of heroes, and an age where man was in communion with the divine, the gods in heaven, Dios himself. For our ancestors, everyday life on the steppe was a spiritual battle. The harsh terrain and unforgiving elements ensured that only those of strong body and strong spirit survived. Even then, man needed his tribe to watch his back for wolves in the night. A strong man survives, but strong men together thrive. Community was the foundational pillar of life for our ancestors, but our ancestral tribes were more than just familial units working and living together. Through ties of blood and kinship, the roots of each family were delicately interwoven. Through the myths and stories shared around the fire after a hard day's work, members of the community, young and old, were reaffirmed into their shared beliefs. Our tribes were more than just family. They were something greater than ourselves, something that we could lay down our lives for, to preserve and to protect. The tribe was life and love. Surely then, to be exiled from your ancestral tribe spelled certain death. My friends, this is not always the case. Those stories told round the fires of our ancestors provide an answer. Our legends tell of a man who voluntarily lived a life of exile. A man who, out of spiritual duty, adopted the wilds as his home. His mind, body, and spirit tempered by Mother Nature's harsh and unforgiving lessons. The Prince of the Woods returned to his people, a king. For thousands of generations, our ancestors told their children an important lesson early in life. To be exiled from the tribe spells certain death. On a whim, one fateful day, the fate of the chief's eldest son was sealed. A jealous queen's intrigue turns father against son. The Rex condemns his son, sending him alone on chariot into the bosom of the wilds. But the boy, a true heir of the solar lineage, did not allow himself to be swallowed by fate. A man cannot survive alone in the forest. In the wilds, man is exposed to Mother Dagon's enchanting beauty and unrelenting apathy. The exiled prince lost his claim, his riches, his future. In time, he loses his horse and chariot too. The harsh wilds distinguish not between noble and slave. The exiled prince has lost everything, and in death is humbled. But this death is only spiritual. The prince kills his past, abandoning the formalities and luxuries of palace life. He exchanges his princely silks for pelt and hide. The exile abandons his birthright and kills his ego as an offering to Dagon Mater. The Earth Mother adopts the boy, earning him a new birthright. The exiled prince is dead. The Prince of the Woods is born. He rises from that fertile earth, the dirt clinging to his face like afterbirth. Under the supervision of Dagon, he grows to become stronger and greater than most men. With a mossy knoll as his throne, he lives for the bow, the hunt, and his goddess. As the young hero trains to face his destiny, Sol's chariot shines overhead. Dios watches with anticipation. But just who is this Prince of the Woods? Let me tell you, my friends. I will tell you as my ancestors taught me and their ancestors taught them. He is archer. He is woodsman. He steps through the brush as silent as a mouse, yet strikes with the speed of a hawk. He is pouncer, the one who springs trap and punctures lung. While the dense bush slows even the strongest of men, he navigates swiftly through the undergrowth. He radiates the aura of a predator, yet can vanish into thin air. The woods that have disoriented and swallowed whole many a man are, to him, as familiar as the back of his hand. for every noble and righteous lord knows their domain intimately. His subjects are the birds and insects and forest critters. Nothing happens in his forest without his knowledge of it. The Prince of the Woods, at times, can be the most ferocious and primal beast, and at other times, the most loving and understanding friend. His claim comes not through birthright, but from his pioneering spirit. Each morning, he awakes early to watch the sun rise and ride across his lands, like the thundering chariots of war he knew in his past life. He is Actaeon, he is Arjun, he is Hippolytus, he is Paris, he is Cucullin, he is Robin Hood, he is Ram. After many years of solitude in the wilds, Dagom Matar's harsh upbringing has forged the boy into the makings of a hero. His mind, body, and spirit have been tempered by the wilds. In time, destiny calls the prince to return to his people, to return to the world he once left behind, the world he knew in his past life. The folly of his father, the old king, has led his tribe to ruin. The exiled son returns home to find his people oppressed and downtrodden. With his newfound strength and abilities, the prince prepares to fight for the people that once banished him. The Prince of the Woods challenges his father for the right to rule. Though himself a skilled warrior and veteran of many battles past, the Mad King accepts his son's duel, but is ultimately unable to match his son's animal-like combat prowess. Defeated and humbled, the Mad King yields the crown to his son. In triumph, the Prince of the Woods returns to his people's cheers and celebrations. The Prince of the Woods returns home, a king! I hope you enjoyed that story, my friends. It provides me the perfect opportunity to talk about one of the archetypes that we find in our ancestral myths, a heroic role that our ancestors determined was important to tell in story to the next generation. By understanding how this ancestral archetype manifests within our own Indo-European mythology from a variety of traditions, we are able to see in front of us one of the paths of herodom that our ancestors have laid out in front of us. This is the path of the Hermit King. The Hermit King is a hero we find in many of our myths. You probably heard me drop a few names in that story, namely Hippolytus, Paris, Ram, Arjun. These heroes are all mythological examples of the Hermit King archetype. The story of the Prince of the Woods tells us how to embark down this path to herodom. To quickly summarize the story, the greed and short-sightedness of the prince's aging father ultimately robs him of his birthright. With little choice, the prince ultimately retreats to the woods. Mother Nature pays little attention to his divine bloodline or the accomplishments of his dynasty. His status as nobility offers the prince no respite from Mother Nature's savage temperament. Two paths lay before him. Like a spoiled brat, the prince can whine and complain about the unfairness of his situation. He had no control over his father's greed and ignorance. The seeds of his kingdom's decline were sown long before he took form in this world. He is but a victim of circumstances. What can he do to change the inevitable? This first path offers little insight into the realization of self and ultimately leads to extinction. The second path involves him accepting the reality of his situation and challenging the fate that his forefathers sentenced him to. As his kingdom crumbles, the prince retreats to the forest, abandons his title, abandons his luxuries, abandons his comfort and pleasure. He completely surrenders himself to nature, embracing the fair but savage realities of Mother Dagom. He knows that the wife of Dios has raised many a hero, many a man to change the ages, many a man to restore his kingdom to former glory. All of the fat from the decadent years of princely life is trimmed by Dego Mater. The exile embraces his new elemental surroundings. In time, his mind, body, and spirit are tempered by the harsh wilderness. Through trial, error, and a little bit of luck, the prince learns to survive and, in time, thrive in the wilds. There is a saying that hard times create strong men, that strong men create good times, that good times create weak men, and that weak men create hard times. While the spiritually delayed view themselves as victim of circumstances, the true noble warrior knows that he himself must take up the responsibility to forge himself into a strong man. Hard times fall upon his kingdom. The exiled prince is the only one who can ensure the survival of his ancient bloodline. Entertainment is not the sole purpose of these stories that our ancestors once told. You see, my friends, our ancestors passed on this knowledge so that, in times of difficulty like those times we face now, here in the Kali Yuga, that we can rise above, that we can become the strong men needed to save the fate of our people, of our lands, of our ancient traditions. The Prince of the Woods recognizes that nature itself is one of the greatest proving grounds. Here in this harsh environment, he tempers his spiritual air, his physical air, and his mental air by establishing himself as Lord of the Wilds, the apex predator in his natural region. The Prince of the Woods is developing the skills, the experience, the spiritual strength required for the ultimately difficult and nigh impossible task of saving his people. By embracing the nigh impossible task set before him with confidence and rising above the circumstances of his birth, the Prince of the Woods is able to ensure that his bloodline is not damned by the greed and ignorance of a few spiritually devoid men. To ensure that the many colorful branches of the Indo-European family survive on for generations to come, we too must approach this path to herodom. We too must face this impossible task and rise above the circumstances of the world we were born into. But ultimately, the path of the Hermit King and the story of the Prince of the Woods is but one path to herodom. My disciples, having shared this most hidden and sacred knowledge with you, I will now divulge some of the archetypal characteristics of the Prince of the Woods. Throughout all of Indo-European mythology, there are some narrative elements that are common within all stories of these Prince of the Woods heroes. These narrative elements appear within many of the stories of the heroes I mentioned earlier. One solid example of this Prince of the Woods archetype is in the story of Ram, which you should be quite familiar with if you listened to episode 2 of the Son of the North podcast. In these Prince of the Woods stories, we often find that it is the actions of a woman that pushes our heroes towards destiny. This woman is often one of the king's wives, but in most stories is not the mother of the prince himself. In contrast to the prince's mother, this queen often has desires that are not in the best favor of the kingdom. These desires actually often involve the prince himself. Because she is unable to materialize these desires, she uses her sway and influence over the king to ultimately force the problematic prince into exile. In the story of Prince Ram, this narrative element manifests as the King Dasharatha's wife's desire to put her son Bharat on the throne instead of Ram. She uses the two boons which the king had promised her in the past to force Ram into exile and to force the king to put Bharat in line for the throne. While it is a mother's duty to ensure the best for her children, the jealous queen's actions ultimately spell doom for the kingdom and its peoples. Another example of the mythical archetype of the jealous queen sealing the fate of her kingdom is found in the story of Hippolytus. If you're not familiar with the myth, the story of Hippolytus originates from the Greek branch of the Indo-European tree. Hippolytus is the son of Theseus and the Amazonian queen Hippolyta. Inheriting his mother's savage nature and love for the wilds, Hippolytus spends most of his time not in the palace, but in the forest, hunting with his trusted Scythian bow, and dedicating worship to the goddess of the hunt and the goddess of the wilds, Artemis. Queen Phaedra, the favorite wife of King Theseus, falls in love with the rugged youth. Phaedra lusts after Hippolytus physically and offers to lie down with the young prince. However, devoted to the virgin goddess of the hunt, Hippolytus rejects Phaedra's advances on him. Frustrated with her inability to take what she wants, Phaedra lies to her husband, King Theseus, telling the aging king that his son lusted after her and forced himself upon her. The once wise Theseus, now driven to impulsive decision at the request of his lover, tries to kill his son and heir Hippolytus. The young prince, fearing for his life, flees the city in his chariot, running towards the wilds he knows so well. Unlike the story of Rom, Hippolytus' story unfortunately does not end in a triumphant return to his kingdom. His father, Theseus, pleads to his own father, the god of the sea, Poseidon, praying that Poseidon use his elemental powers to kill his son. Unaware of the true sequence of events that happened, Poseidon sends a huge bull to rise from the sea after Hippolytus. The bull startles Hippolytus' horses, launching him from the seat of his chariot. The horses then drag the poor exiled prince to his death. This tragic ending to the story of Hippolytus, however, is perhaps a Greek cultural evolution of this ancient Indo-European mythic structure. The version of the myth involving Hippolytus' death was made famous by the dramatic works of the Greek playwright Euripides. In the original myth, the heroic archetype that Hippolytus symbolizes would ultimately return to his kingdom, clear up the misunderstandings of his father, take the throne, and save his people by returning the kingdom to prosperity. Continuing on, in the story of the Prince of the Woods, the prince is ultimately exiled into the forest and spends many years there, surviving through masterful usage of the bow. This is seen in the story of Ram, as well as the story of Arjuna in the Mahabharata. Some people would even claim that this is seen in the story of Genghis Khan, who, after his father's death, is exiled to the forests of Mongolia's north with his mother and his siblings. With no other choice for survival, the future Lord of the Steppes takes his bow and, with his brothers, heads into the forest every day to hunt meager game to sustain their family. Genghis Khan, later in the secret history of the Mongols, himself attributes this upbringing in the harsh woods of Mongolia as a key element in the development of the character that would be Genghis Khan. While not strictly Indo-European, it is unquestionable that the other cultures of the steppes, namely the Turks and Mongolic peoples, were ultimately shaped in their beliefs and worldview by our Indo-European ancestors. Naturally, the cult of the Sky Father would be easy to propagate amongst these other steppe peoples, and we see traces of it today in historical and modern-day Tengriism. For the mytho-historical princes of the forest to ascend and become hermit kings in their own right, each of them had to use the harsh lessons that they learned from their lives in the wild to overcome the odds and change their people's destiny. It is wise then, my friends, that we look at these myths, that we understand the stories of the Prince of the Forest, that we know that the harsh lessons learned in nature through a life in accordance with the wilds ultimately make us into stronger people, people who are able to rise above the fate that was sown for us by our forefathers in times of unrighteousness, of atheistic nature, of ignorance of ancestral tradition. We've reached the break segment of this podcast, my friends. As usual, I would advise that you get up and stretch a little bit. Go grab a glass of water and perhaps a nice healthy snack. Today, I'm munching on some venison jerky that a good friend of mine made. In my mind, not many foods can compare to nice homemade jerky. It's a great source of protein for those long days, and it's pretty light. It's perfect for bringing on the trail. During the break segment of last week's episode of the Son of the North podcast, I had mentioned the solar metal band Sol Anahata that was started by my friends over at the Oathblood tribe. To prepare for this week's show, I reached out to Kyle and Yon at Sol Anahata and asked them if they could send me a song to play for you, my viewers. A song that perfectly captures the essence of the new genre of solar metal. The guys are fully on board with what I do here at Son of the North, so they sent me one of the most popular tracks from their new album. It's actually probably my favorite track by them. I'm gonna play that song for you now, and after it's finished, we'll get back on with today's show. I hope you enjoy it, my friends. Without further ado, here is Strength Through Steel by Sol Anahata.
Gather around, I'll tell you what the
Wow. Just sensational stuff from Sol Anahata there. If that doesn't inspire you to follow the heroic path, then, frankly, I don't know what will. Truly based and solar pilled. Alright, well, I think that's been a great little break. I'm sure you guys are feeling refreshed now that you've had your glass of milk and a bit of stretching. So, without further ado, we're going to move into the second part of today's podcast. Discussing the heroic archetype of the Prince of the Woods is actually great for the purposes of this episode because it allows me to continue our conversation on the Ramayana, and particularly an element of the Ramayana that I believe is hinting at a larger and much, much older Indo-European mythic narrative structure. While the Prince of the Woods has his own heroic cycle centered around his exploits, the character actually plays a very important role in many Indo-European myths. Most notably, in the story of the abduction of the radiant goddess Hausos. This ancient myth, largely lost, survives in the Hindu story of the Ramayana and in the Greek mythic cycle of the Trojan War. In both of these stories, a radiant divine princess, a daughter of Dyaus, is abducted by a man who lusts after her physical beauty and incomparable radiance. In the Ramayana, Hausos, the radiant goddess, manifests as the golden princess Sita. In the Illiad and the other stories of the Trojan War cycle, Hausos manifests as the beautiful Helen, daughter of Zeus, and the object of desire for many Bronze Age kings. In each story respectively, the Prince of the Woods takes an important role as either the hero or the abductor of the dawn goddess. In the case of the Ramayana, the Prince of the Woods is manifested in the hero Ram, whereas in the Trojan War cycle, the Prince of the Woods is manifested as the tragic hero Paris. While these two depictions differed based on their different cultural interpretations, the important takeaway for us as those seeking to preserve and fan the flame of Indo-European traditions is not whether or not the Prince of the Woods is the protagonist or antagonist of the mythic structure, but that the Prince of the Woods is romantically associated with the radiant dawn goddess Hausos. The similarities between Ram and Paris are perhaps not quite obvious to those uninitiated. While Paris is known as the son of King Priam of Troy, and in the story acts like a decadent, spoiled prince, the hero is introduced to Greek mythology not in the palace, but instead in the fields, wandering and caring for his flock as a shepherd. The gods, seeing him as a pure and righteous individual living in nature, determine that he is a suitable judge for the contest that Eris initiates. In a similar vein, Ram is considered by most characters within the epic to be spiritually pure and righteous due to his sage-like lifestyle, living in the forest alone with his devoted brother and his lovely wife. Both characters spend many years in the woods, being shaped by their experiences and their misadventures, ultimately before returning home to the palace to seal the fate of the kingdom, whether that fate be extinction or prosperity. The similarities between the Ramayana and the Trojan War cycle don't end here. Both stories involve the assembling of massive armies of many different tribes for the purposes of rescuing the radiant goddess from her captors. Also in both stories, the massive armies have to cross the sea and wage war outside the walls of the city to determine which faction Hausos will end up with in the end. Both stories also involve the sieging of an otherwise considered impregnable city. The walls of each city are eventually breached. The infiltration of both of the invading armies is associated with animals. In the Ramayana, Ram is able to conquer Lanka with the assistance of a monkey army. In the case of the ancient Greeks in the Illiad, the infiltration of Troy is made possible due to Odysseus's clever trick of the Trojan horse. The exact animal and the role it played in the fall of the city in the original Indo-European iteration of this myth is ultimately unknown, but speculation can lead to some interesting ideas. to offer you one final comparison. In both the Iliad and in the Ramayana, the falls of Lanka and Troy are predicted by somebody who's related to the king. In the Ramayana, the fall of Lanka is predicted by evil King Ravan's brother Vibhishan. In the Iliad, Troy's destruction is foretold by the prophetess Cassandra, daughter of Troy's king Priam. A thorough reading of the myths left behind by our ancestors clearly suggests an earlier Indo-European myth involving the invasion of a city for the purposes of rescuing the radiant goddess. In this earlier myth, the Prince of the Woods, as a heroic archetype, is central to the story, either as Hausos' rightful lover or as her abductor. As manifestations of the Prince of the Woods, Ram and Paris each choose a different one of the two paths I mentioned earlier. After returning to the palace following his exile in the wilds, Paris ignores the lessons he learned from nature and instead acts upon his impulses, enslaved by his lust for the radiant goddess Helen. Ram, on the other hand, applies the skills he learned during his time in exile, the skills that allowed him and his family to survive in the woods for so long, to save his wife from her captor, to return to his kingdom, the conquering king, to restore prosperity to the lives of his people. Our ancestors told this myth around the fire for a purpose. They wanted us to reflect on the story of the Prince of the Woods. They wanted us to decide on which path was right for us. Shall we accept that we are victims of circumstances, that we cannot change the fate that is destined for our people? Or shall we rise to the challenge, submit to the harsh realities of nature, and become stronger people, heroes capable of challenging fate, of securing a better world for our families, for our children, for our tribe? In the examples of Paris and Ram, we can see the consequences of choosing each path. Having reconciled these once separated mythic narratives, I now present both paths to you, my listener. Will you sit by idly, living on as a weak man during hard times? Or will you rise to these hard times, let them forge you into a hero that is capable of changing the world? At the end of the day, I can only offer guidance as to which decision you should make. The choice to rise to the path of herodom is ultimately yours, my friend. But during your moments of doubt, moments when you question whether or not you have the potential to change fate, I will always be here to offer you that guidance. The ancient Indo-European mythic structure of the divine siege, the war to rescue the dawn goddess from the forces that have abducted her, is particularly theologically deep because it involves not one of the heroic archetypes, but several. In the Ramayana, we are told of the magnificent and Herculean exploits of the god Hanuman, who himself is a manifestation of the heroic archetype of the son of the striker. With close ties to the mastery of the physical air, the son of the striker is able to use his strength and endurance to achieve Herculean tasks. Manifestations of this particular heroic archetype often end up being deified as the god of strength. By reading through various Indo-European sources, it seems that this apotheosis is a central character trait of most of this heroic archetype's iterations. Aside from Hanuman, the Greco-Roman god Heracles, or Hercules, is another example of the son of the striker heroic archetype, and, like Hanuman, is treated as a deity in recognition of his feats of strength. The early Anglo-Saxon hero Beowulf is another example of this son of the striker archetype. Because of their great strength, it should not come as a surprise that all three of these heroes are known for wrestling and killing monsters with their bare hands. Hanuman engages in hand-to-hand combat with some of Ravan's generals. Hercules wrestles the Nemean lion, strangling it to death before using its impenetrable hide to make a cape. When the monstrous and terrifying Grendel, son of one of the many adversaries, comes to interrupt the parties at Herod, Beowulf strips naked and challenges him to a duel, wrestling the creature before ripping his arm off. Surely such remarkable feats of strength are only possible if one is able to temper their physical air to its strongest potential. On the topic of monster slaying, it is interesting to note that Hanuman, Hercules, and Beowulf all have associations with the slaying of aquatic serpents. Hanuman fights demonic serpents while flying over the seas to Lanka. Hercules fights the Lernaean Hydra in a swamp. Beowulf interrupts his swimming contest to fight and kill several sea monsters. The necessity of conflict between the son of the striker and some sort of aquatic serpent creates a mythology that makes the hero's destiny run parallel to that of his father, the striker, who's also associated with the slaying of serpents. Even Diaus himself, in some Indo-European mythologies, is associated with the slaying of serpents associated with water. The most famous of our ancestral myths that involve the storm god fighting a serpent are that of Thor and Jormungandr, the world serpent, and that of Zeus and his conflict with the serpentine monster Typhon. It seems that, to our ancestors, the snake itself was the ideal symbol for representing the various forces of the adversarial evil. This is perhaps a reference to the autochthonous origins of the adversarial evil. But we'll talk more about the origins and nature of the adversarial evil in another episode of the Son of the North podcast. We will talk about the other heroic archetypes in more detail in another later episode of the podcast as well. In the Greek interpretation of this ancient Indo-European mythic structure regarding Hausos abduction, another archetypal hero is evident, that of the trickster prince. In the story of the Trojan War, this trickster is obviously King Odysseus, whose guile and ingenuity allows the Achaeans to break through Troy's defenses and ultimately seal the fate of the doomed city. Each of the three heroic archetypes I've mentioned so far is known for their association and mastery over one of the three airs. The spirit air, the mind air, the body air. These three primordial heroic essences make up the center of the chariot wheel of heroism. But the wheel of heroism is a topic for another day. Sunday is a sacred and holy day dedicated to Sol, and I shan't take up any more of your time. I want to thank you for tuning in to today's episode of the Son of the North podcast. I hope that the hidden knowledge that I've shared with you today will help you to better understand our place within this world in the Kali Yuga. I hope you enjoyed your time with me today. I hope you enjoyed this temporary escape from the soul-crushing insanity of the Kali Yuga. Hey everybody, it's Rex here. I just want to share with you a decision I made regarding the upload schedule for the podcast. Now that winter has retreated up here in Hyperborea and the ground has frosted, my full-time job has started to pick up a lot in terms of the work schedule, and so unfortunately I found myself with less and less time to work on the podcast. I hope that someday I can use this podcast as a platform to approach my eventual goal of self-sufficiency, but for now I'm going to need to drain the system dry a little bit longer. Fear not though, my friends. This isn't an announcement stating that I'm taking a hiatus away from the podcast or anything of that sort. Rather, I just wanted to let you know that I'm probably going to be uploading a new episode every 2 weeks now instead of every week. Not only will this allow me to accommodate my new hectic work schedule with my podcast schedule, but it will also give me a bit more time to do more in-depth research and produce higher quality episodes of the podcast for you guys. So yeah, I just wanted to thank you for your consideration and understanding on this matter. While I'm at it, I'm going to let you know that we've got some great episodes coming up in the coming weeks. I'm hoping to have a few more guest episodes. Right now, I'm trying to schedule interviews with Sunatru, Goon Pagan, and the ever so popular Nature is My Church. So I'm sure you guys are really going to enjoy that. I think these guests are very knowledgeable in regards to paganism and Aryan traditions. So I think you guys are really going to be in for a treat. I'm sure they're going to bring some great insight and anecdotes to the show. On that positive note, I'll let you go, but I want to thank you for sticking around so far. I hope that the gods bless you and your loved ones in the coming week. Stay solar, my friends.